Mark, thank you for your second lesson. Thank you for your time, for sharing us with this content. Please give us next step. What should we consider in this way?
Okay. So I believe in the first session, I was emphasizing how one of the most distinctive features of the Jaimini system was the special karakas that come about based on a planet's degrees within a chart. The planet with the highest degrees being the Atma Karaka, planet with the lowest degrees being the Dara Karaka, and so on. And I was showing how you can predict sometimes in a very simple, straightforward way using these karakas. And then another distinctive feature that we spoke about was that the dashas are signs in the Jaimini system as opposed to like their planetary dashas, planetary periods in the Parashari system. So at any one time, a person is running the major period of some sign, right? And also the sub-period of some sign. Now in the Jaimini system, the longest any dasha can be is just 12 years. And therefore, within that dasha of 12 years, there'd be the sub-periods that would be 1 year apiece. The shortest that a sign period can be is just 1 year, in which case the sub-periods would only last a month. Sometimes the advantage of that is that, you can narrow time frames better with sign-based periods that you can sometimes with planetary periods. Think, for example, in the Vimshotri dashas, 20 years Venus, right? And so the sub-periods, some sub-periods are 3 years. So those are rather large time frames, and therefore to kind of zero in short-term more on a specific event is sometimes requires different levels of the dashas. Whereas usually with Jaimini, you can focus in on a pretty short period where an event could happen, like a marriage or a childbirth, just using the major period and the sub-period. So the lesson that I'm going to be giving today is what I developed as a step-by-step, 8-step process for interpreting any sign-based period, right? And so if you want to become proficient at the Jaimini system, you just have to, every time you're going to interpret what a sign period you bring for someone, if you just go through these 8 steps, you'll be able to extract a lot of accurate interpretation and potentially good predictions based on that. So let me start that by sharing a screen that is going to have a document. The document's going to be in English. I'll send you this and you can maybe translate it into Russian. But the first step here is a very simple step. So every sign in the horoscope is going to be related to some house. So when a person's running the sign, the major period of some sign, it's going to be pertaining to some house of the horoscope. So what that means is that all the indications of that house will really come into focus during that period. And you can predict just on that basis. Now I'm going to share screen and bring up my program because each of these steps I'm going to want to illustrate by using an actual chart where I'm applying them. And I'm actually, because it's just easy for me, I'm going to use my own chart to illustrate this first step. So the particular Jaimini dasha, sign-based dasha that we're using here is called Chara dasha. And Chara dasha is to the Jaimini system what the Vimshotri dasha is to the Parashari system, meaning it's an all-purpose dasha for predicting any event, and you can use it to predict on any horoscope. That's what I mean by an all-purpose dasha, right? And so if you look down in this program at Chara dasha, you can see for me, it started back in 2016. I moved into my Gemini major period, right? And of course, which house of the horoscope is Gemini? It is, of course, my 10th house. So the simple interpretation about some of what the Gemini period would be all about is that it would emphasize my activities in the world. In other words, my career and professional activities, which has been completely true. In fact, this period was going to last 10 years. As I said, it started in 2016, will go up until April 2026. And really, because the whole purpose of my life has been able to carry on the legacy of my Jyotish guru, K.N. Rao, to basically teach Jyotish in the style in which he taught Jyotish, both Parashari and the Jaimini system, that's been really almost the entire focus of my life since I've moved into the Gemini period, the 10th house of my horoscope, right? So that's the first step. Now, there's an additional element to that because I may have mentioned, or people may be aware that in the Jaimini system, we use a special lagna called the karakamsha lagna when we look at what sign period a person is running. Just in the way in which in the Prashri system, we might see a planetary period where it falls from the birth lagna in a house, but then we also might look at where it falls from the moon, Chandra lagna. In other words, we'd see it from an alternative lagna to maybe get additional information about what it can bring. So in the Jaimini system, we use something called the karakamsha lagna. How do we determine that? We take the planet with the highest degrees, we see where it falls in Navamsha, what sign it falls in, take that sign, bring it back to the birth chart, and use it as a lagna. So in my case, the moon is the Atmakaraka, and if you look down in Navamsha here, you'll see that it falls in Scorpio. So Scorpio becomes my what's called Karakamsha lagna. And if we go back and we put it in the birth chart, and we see which sign, which house Gemini is for there, then we get some additional information about what the sign period of Gemini can bring. And we see that from Scorpio, Gemini is the 8th house. So think about what house rules occult sciences, esoteric sciences like astrology. Of course, it's the 8th house. So the fact that it's the 10th house from my birth lagna, emphasizing career, but it's the 8th house from Scorpio, emphasizing involvement and interest and focus on esoteric matters such as occult sciences, such as Jyotish, which again has been very, very true. So step one is to see which house of the horoscope a particular sign is, both from the birth lagna and from the karakamsha lagna, right? Okay. So now I'm going to go back to the document and we're going to look at step two. So it's important to know that in the Jaimini system, all the grahas, the planets, including Rahu and Ketu, have 3 levels of significance and interpretation. So the first level is the simple designation or classification of all the grahas as natural benefics or natural malefics, right? So the next thing we want to see in step 2 is to see a particular sign that you're running at any time, whether by occupation or by aspect, it's getting the influence of natural benefics or is it getting the influence of natural malefics? And very often you'll see it's getting both. In which case, is it getting the influence more by occupation and aspect of natural benefics, or is it getting the influence more of natural malefics? Generally speaking, if a planet or a sign is getting the influence of a lot of natural benefics and not that much malefic influence, then generally speaking, that's going to be a favorable period. It's going to bring out the favorable indications of whatever house it represents. And so this is the second thing that we look at. Is the sign getting the influence of natural benefics or is it getting the influence of natural malefics? And of course, if those benefics are strong, then that's even a more favorable influence, right? So this is what we look for next. And I'm going to bring up my program again. And if we focus again on the period that I've been running, which is Gemini, we see that it isn't occupied by any planets, but it is getting the influence of 2 grahas by what's called Rashi Drishti. We have to remember that in the Jaimini system, the aspects that we're using is called Rashi Drishti, meaning sign aspects, in which case all the planets in the dual Rashis, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces, are going to be aspecting each other and also aspecting those signs. So Gemini gets the influence of 2 grahas, Jupiter, but also Saturn. So one favorable influence of a strong Jupiter, but then one influence of a natural malefic, Saturn. So it's kind of a mixed condition, which is what you will often see. I'm going to bring up a situation where it's more tilted in one way or another, and it relates to a prediction I made on this chart. So you can see in the Jaimini system, this person has been running the major period of Virgo, right? And but what I wanted to focus in on is a prediction I made based on the sub-period of Capricorn, which took place back in the end of 2023. Okay, so you can see we're in the sub-period of Capricorn from June of 2022 to April 2023. So focused in on Capricorn. So who's there? Two natural benefics, right? In fact, the two best natural benefics, Venus and Jupiter. Jupiter here is in a particularly good condition. It's in its debilitation sign, but it's not that strong. But it continues as a natural benefic. And then who else influences Capricorn? The two planets in Scorpio form a Rashi Drishti because fixed signs like Scorpio aspect the movable signs like Capricorn, except for the ones next to them. So, in other words, the planets in Capricorn, the planets in Scorpio are forming, Rashi Drishtis with each other. So Capricorn now gets the influence of all three natural benefics, Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury, and of course also the Sun. Now, this is a little bit more advanced, but some of those grahas form what's called Jaimini Raja Yogas, when the planet with the highest degrees, the Sun here, the AK, is connected with the PK, which is Venus in this case. PK represents every signification of the fifth. So it's like a 1-5 combination, right? Which forms a good Raja Yoga. So I predicted that the sub-period of Capricorn would be an especially good period for him. And bring out some Raja Yoga type qualities, meaning success in his position that he was in. And it turned out to be true. But what I'm really highlighting here is that when we go to interpret a sign, we're seeing what the influences are on. And if there's a lot of influence of natural benefics, this can be a favorable indication as to what some of that sign could bring. Now, of course, the opposite is true. If it's mostly the influence of natural malefics, then this can be troublesome. Let me show you an example of that. You can see that back at age 27 to 37, this is a chart of an Indian woman living and working in the US, a former student of mine, who ran the Sagittarius period from 2009 to 2019. So remember, it's all the planets in the dual Rashis are going to be influencing each other. Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces. And so really what you see here is the influence of all the malefics onto this house. And of course, it's the 8th house of the horoscope, one of those trick houses, right? Now it contains the AMK, and in the last lesson we talked about when a sign contains the AMK, it can be a time that to actually give them positions. And if it forms any Jaimini Raja Yogas, then they can be good professionally. And she had some good professional success during this time, but it also came with a lot of difficulties, with a lot of problems. She had a real issue with the managers she worked for, who put her on a performance improvement plan, which can be a first step to a person actually losing their job. And there was other things that were going on during that time that made this period quite a bit a time when she was suffering in different ways. And the way that could be immediately seen in the Jaimini system, that this would be a troublesome, difficult major period in many ways, is just the fact that it has the influence of all the natural malefics, ignoring for the moment what Jaimini Karaka they are, right? Now, coming to the next step, I won't pull up the document, but the next step is to think about these planets' influences on a sign in terms of their natural significations, not in terms of whether they're benefics or malefics, but in terms of what their natural significations are. So you can see now, I had predicted this woman's marriage. She married later in life. She married after she had actually turned well, I'll highlight this just because it's a good lesson. I predicted that she would marry in her Libra period. And how was that done? Well, one of the steps we're going to talk about is we use Libra, the sign that she's running, as a lagna, and see where the karakas fall from there. And we talked about last time that one of the ways to predict marriage is when a person is running a sign containing the DK, the Dara Karaka, the planet with the fewest degrees, or from where the Dara Karaka falls seventh, either in the birth chart or in Navamsha. So it can be seen here that her DK, the planet with the fewest degrees, is Mercury. And if you look in Navamsha, you can see that in Navamsha, her Mercury goes to Aries, which is the seventh house from Libra. So I could see that this period could, and it did, bring marriage, and it happened in the sub-period of Libra itself, Libra. But then she was going to be moving into, she's going to be in Libra for a while. Well, actually, she moved into Virgo, right? Okay. So what I'm showing you here is that we look at a sign and the influences on it, both in terms of natural benefics, natural malefics, but also in terms of what karaka is in the house. Say, for example, a person runs a sign containing Venus. Venus is the natural karaka of love and relationships and marriage. So any sign containing Venus becomes eligible for bringing, or where Venus falls seventh, this becomes eligible for giving a person marriage during that period based on the natural significations of Venus. I just thought of an example that way. I'm actually going to bring up the chart here of a rather famous American movie star and celebrity, a woman by the name of Gwyneth Paltrow. You can see that Venus here is in Cancer, right? And so when she runs either a Venus, a Cancer period or a Cancer sub-period, then it's going to make this period eligible for giving that result, or from where Venus falls seventh. So she married in her Virgo Capricorn period. Now look at Virgo. It contains 3 grahas and 3 special Jaimini karakas. Sun as the PK, Mercury as the MK, but Mars as the DK. So containing Mars, it becomes eligible for giving her marriage. It did so in the sub-period of Capricorn. Why the sub-period of Capricorn? Well, because Venus, the natural significator of marriage, is falling seventh from there. So this is how Virgo Capricorn in the Jaimini system indicated a period and sub-period when she could marry, and she did. But I mentioned that she also has the PK there. PK stands for all the indications of the 5th house, which of course would include children. So subsequently, because she ran this period, she married at age 33 in 2005, this period was going to go all the way up to 2014. So during this time, she also had 2 children. Right? So I'm emphasizing that when we look at a sign, and whether it's being occupied or aspected by some planet, some graha, we're looking at that planet in 3 ways. Is it a natural benefic or is it a natural malefic? That's one way. Then we're saying, what are its natural significations? If a sign, for example, contains Jupiter, regardless of what karaka Jupiter is, that period can bring a child simply because Jupiter is the natural significator of children, okay? And then, the third level we're looking at is what special karaka is that particular planet? Because when a person runs the sign containing any karaka, then some event related to that karaka can happen. Let me show you this chart where I predicted the purchase of a luxury property for someone using this idea that I just explained. So you can see in this chart that this person has been running their Leo major period since 2019. Look at two things. It's the fourth house of the horoscope. Fourth house rules property, homes, also vehicles. Venus happens to be there, but Venus happens to also be the MK, the planet with the fourth highest degrees, and therefore carrying all the significations of the fourth house, including home and property. So it was a rather easy prediction for me to predict that he would acquire, and I said it would be a luxury property. Why? Leo relates to things like luxury, and Venus is Venus, which is also having to do with, something that's beautiful or expensive or luxurious. And so the man in this period has ended up purchasing a home worth 3.5 million. Obviously, it's a luxury property. Now, I'm not showing sub-period. I predicted the sub-period would happen, but mostly I want to establish the idea here that whenever, so it's Venus, a natural benefic in the house, right, which is good for the house. Secondarily, though, it's the MK, so it can bring the indications of the fourth house, and it's the fourth house itself. So you can see all this combined made it very clear to me as to something that could happen during this time, and I made my prediction based on this. I'm going to pause at this point. Is there any questions you have about anything I've said thus far, or is it all clear?
Well, for now it's clear, but I just have some questions about should we consider the lordship of that planet?
Now, okay, good. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's the next step. So after we've seen the influences on the sign in terms of natural benefics, natural malefics, natural significations of the planets that are influencing the sign, and then the special signification of the planet based on its being a particular Jaimini karaka, the next thing we want to see is what planet rules that sign and what Jaimini karaka is it. Because based on that, this sign could give the results of that Jaimini karaka. Let me show you an example of that. So you can see that in recent history, this person has run their Leo major period. That Leo major period ran from age 20 to 31. Now, it's the 10th house of the birth chart. So again, there'd be a real focus on career matters. It contains 2 natural benefics, so that's a plus, right? In fact, in the Jaimini system, there's such a thing called graha bala, meaning how you judge the strength of a particular sign. And one of the sutras in the Jaimini Sutras says that when a planet simultaneously gets the influence of both Jupiter and Mercury, as in this case, then it becomes particularly strong in terms of giving its results. But then what specific karakas does it contain? Well, it contains the AMK, and one of the things we talked about last time was how when you run a sign containing the AMK, then this could be a time that gives you a position, that gives you career success, maybe even elevation in your career life. This is going to be especially true if it forms some Jaimini Raja yogas, which it does, because Saturn over there in Capricorn aspects Leo and vice versa. Capricorn is the PK, and the AMK PK combination is one of the Jaimini Raja yogas. So this would indicate what could happen in terms of her getting positions and her being successful in her career life. But what I'm leading up to is that it's the sign Leo, which of course is ruled by what planet? Of course, it's ruled by the sun. And then we have to see what karaka the sun is, because in running the Leo major period, it's also going to activate the sun as the Dara karaka. So in Leo, she also married. Now, this can be seen also because of the Navamsha, where Leo in Navamsha is the 7th house of the Navamsha, and from Leo in Navamsha, Dara karaka's sun falls in the 7th house. So Leo can bring the marriage number one in the birth chart because it's ruled by the sun, the Dara Karaka, but also number two, based on what I just talked about in terms of the Navamsha. In the Vimshotri system, it was her Jupiter moon period, which can be seen with the idea of Dasha Lagna, because from Jupiter, moon goes to the seventh house in the birth chart. So one of the steps that I'm talking about here, one of the 8 steps, is to see also which planet rules a particular sign period that's running, and then interpret that also in terms of some results it can give that way as far as what planet is that Karaka. I'm going to pull up my own chart again to illustrate this idea further. So going back to the idea, I've been running Gemini. Who's it ruled by? Of course, it's ruled by Mercury, which Karaka is Mercury for me. It's the Atmakaraka. And, there's a lot going on with that. It gets the association of the planets it's with in Aries, but also the 2 grahas in Leo. And the best combination there is a combination of the AK moon and the AMK Mercury, which is a very good Jaimini Raja yoga. And so this is also one of the ways we would interpret what Gemini could give, not just based on planets that are either in it or aspecting it, but also what planets are ruling it and which Jaimini Karaka that planet is, because it's going to give the results of that planet in terms of its Karaka significations, in which case the AMK, which is a career indicator. Right? Is that clear?
Yes, it's clear.
Now, a very interesting additional way in which we let me go back to the document. So actually, I've talked about steps 1 through 5, and now what I want to talk about is a very interesting step, which is step 6. In Jaimini, we use these things called padas. What is a pada? Sometimes also referred to as an aruda or a pada. So how do we determine padas? Padas are determined by taking any house, any sign, taking the Lord, see how many signs that Lord has gone from its own sign forward in the zodiac, and then counting an equal number from there, right? So if, for example, in my chart, you wanted to calculate the pada of the first house, how would we do this? Well, my ascendant is Virgo, the Lord is Mercury, so we count forward in the zodiac how many signs, how many houses. Mercury has gone from Virgo, it goes to Aries, which is 8 signs away. And then we count an equal number of signs from there. If you count 8 signs from Aries, you come to Scorpio. So Scorpio would be considered the pada of my first house. Pada of my first house, right? So whenever I run Scorpio, some of the indications related to my first house can come out at that time. Let me take another example. We talked about how the 8th house is the house of the esoteric sciences, right? Such as astrology. Well, if you calculate what would be the 8th house, pada, because Mars, the Lord, is actually in the house, then it becomes its own pada. But I want to show you an example of how this can be used to predict. And to do that, I'm going to bring up the chart of, unfortunately, the person who's the current president of the United States, Donald Trump. Donald Trump first married his first wife. He's had 3. He married his first wife in the major period of Sagittarius and the sub-period of Aquarius. This was back when he was 30 years old. You can see that at age 24 to age 33, he ran his Sagittarius period. and the sub-period of Aquarius happened from age 30 to 31. This is where he married his first wife, Ivanka. In what way was it predictable that this period and sub-period could bring marriage? Well, Aquarius is a sub-period giving this result would be very obvious, right? Why? It's the seventh house of the horoscope. Now, additionally, it's ruled by who? It's ruled by Saturn, who's the DK. Additionally, Saturn as the DK aspects Aquarius. So there's three ways in which Aquarius, as the sub-period here, shows the eligibility for giving marriage. It's the seventh house. It's ruled by the Dara Karka Saturn. It even gets the aspect of the Dara Karka Saturn. But why and how does Sagittarius give marriage? Well, calculate the pada of the seventh house. How do we do that? We take Aquarius, the seventh house, and we see how many signs forward in the zodiac the Lord has gone, which is Saturn, right? So count Aquarius to Cancer is 6, and then you count 6 more from Cancer, you arrive to Sagittarius. Sagittarius becomes the pada of the seventh house, sometimes called the Aruda of the seventh house. And as such, like the seventh house itself, it also becomes eligible for bringing this event. So now I'm going to show you an example of how I use the concepts of padas to make a prediction that was kind of a risky prediction, and I'll explain why it was a risky prediction when I bring the chart up. So it's risky to predict childbirth on this chart because of the conditions of Jupiter as the karaka and also the conditions of the fifth house, fifth lord, both from the birth lagna and from the moon. What happens here? Jupiter here is with all these planets in Libra, but see its degrees. It's combust, too close to the sun. It's actually loses in a planetary war to Venus, and it's also with Saturn, who happens to be a bad eighth lord for this lagna. So that's the condition of the karaka of children Jupiter, some of which is quite unfavorable. Then what happens to the fifth house? There's no planets in the fifth house, but the fifth lord Mars goes to the sixth house, afflicted by the Rahu Ketu aspects, and also aspected by Saturn. I'm doing Parashari Jyotish now, right? So not a good condition of the fifth house, fifth lord. Even from the moon, Jupiter becomes the fifth lord, and now the fifth house itself from the moon has the malefic Mars with the Rahu Ketu axis, again aspected by Saturn. So this woman had a very difficult time conceiving and having children. Through the in vitro process, through fertility technology, she had been able to have a child, but then 9 years went by, and her husband had been trying to have a child unsuccessfully. And this is at which point they consulted with me about the prospect of having a child ever. This was in the fall of 2021. So what I had to consider from the Jaimini standpoint was that she was running her Capricorn period at the time. So I had to ask myself the question whether the Capricorn period showed any eligibility for giving this event. And the only way it showed any eligibility is because it was the pada of the fifth house. So who's the fifth house? It's Scorpio. Who's the Lord? It's Mars. How many signs does Mars go from Scorpio? 1. So counting 1 again from Sagittarius, the place of the fifth lord, brings us to Capricorn. Capricorn becomes the pada of the fifth house. So I did see this major period as being eligible for giving a child. Now, there's a lot more that went into the prediction, looking at both from the Parashari point of view and the Jaimini point of view, but I'm just showing that I was able to successfully predict that she would have a child in the Capricorn period based on the fact that it's the pada of the fifth house. So what is this telling us? Any sign that is the pada of some house also becomes eligible for giving events related to that house. Fifth house rules children, so the fifth pada can bring a child. Seventh house rules marriage, so the seventh pada can bring a marriage. Is it clear?
Yes, but is it like a final chance for this person? Because if the fifth house also in the Papa Kartari yoga and the fifth lord and everything, as you mentioned, and the only thing which could realize the child is this pada conception.
Well, like I said, there was much more to the story. I mean, I was looking at this in numerous dasha systems. I was looking at it in the prosperous system. I was looking at the Jaimini. I wouldn't make my prediction that she'd have a child in Capricorn just because that alone is the only factor that shows the eligibility for bringing this. It was a confluence of things. It was using that composite technique that I talked about, where we were using prosperous planetary periods side by side, alongside with Jaimini considerations. And when you see the confluence between the two, where both systems are showing the potential at a particular time, that was the basis of my prediction. I can't show all that because it would just be too complicated, right? But all I'm saying is that I would have never considered that from the Jaimini point of view that she could have a child this time unless I saw that Capricorn was the fifth pada. This is the thing that made this period eligible. There was no other factor that made this period eligible. So that's why whenever we are interpreting the sign period of anyone, one of the steps is to see if it's the pada of any particular house. Now, I will show you that our programs will give you this. Let me just. So, really, rather than calling them padas, it's referring to them as arudas, right? And so you can see that all the padas, all the different arudas are identified here. The program identifies them. And so you can see how the aruda or the pada of the fifth house is identified here as being Capricorn. But many of the different houses also become the pada of some other house. If I apply this to my own chart, you can see that, here are the padas as they relate to my house. I told you that, the pada lagna, the pada of the first house, is also referred to as the Aruda lagna, and we calculated that actually to be Scorpio, as we can see here, okay? In Jaimini, and this is a concept that oftentimes is very confusing to students, there's this concept called Argalas. I almost hesitate to get into it here because it's very confusing to people. But one of the things that we look at when a person is running any sign is whether there's any Argala formations to that sign, because this can help lock down and solidify some of the results that can give. So I'm going to pull up the chart of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy to illustrate this idea of Argalas. So here is Kennedy's chart, and I want everyone to focus on Aries, which is the period in which he both became president of the United States, but also was killed. He was assassinated. And how it shows him obtaining some very high political position is that it contains one of the most dramatic, one of the most powerful Jaimini Raja yogas, which is a combination of the AK and the AMK. AMK here is especially strong because it's both in its own sign in the birth chart and goes to its own sign Scorpio in Navamsha. Aries is the 8th house from the birth chart, but it's the 5th house from the Karakamsha Lagna Sagittarius. One of the words used in the ancient text for the 5th house is Raja, or the authority to rule. But of course, it's also the 8th house. It contains this AMK, which pertains to him as a physical embodied person. It does have the influence of a natural malefic, and this is the indication that he could also, this can be a very dangerous period, and was the period in which he was assassinated. Now, what I wanted to highlight here was the way in which Aries receives some what's called Argala formations. Argalas take place from 3 different positions from any sign. From any sign, if planets fall in the 2nd house from that sign, without planets in the 12th house from there, then this is an unobstructed Argala. So in the case of Kennedy's chart, for Aries, 3 grahas fall in the 2nd house from there, which would be Taurus, and there would be no planets in the 12th house from there, which would be Pisces, to obstruct them. And this is what's called a Shubha Argala, meaning an Argala involving natural benefics, one of whom is quite strong here, it being Venus. Now, when planets are in the 4th house from somewhere, and there's no planets in the 10th house from there, this is also forming a principal Argala. So Saturn here is in the 4th house from Aries, and there's no planets in the 10th from there, which would be Capricorn. So this is a second Argala. So what's the effect of Argala? The term literally refers to a bolt or a lock. So when you have Argala formations, particularly beneficial ones like the ones in Taurus here, onto any sign, it helps, you might solidify and lock down the potential results of that sign. And it's one of the ways in which Jaimini Raja yogas get qualified, meaning they have an additional factor that increases their quality. So again, one of the reasons that Aries proved to be able to give him, the position that it did, the presidency of the United States, was not only because of this Raja Yoga forming in Aries, but also because of, the Argala formations to it. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. I know it's a lot to absorb, but again, if you're going to become proficient with making predictions based on the Jaimini system, you have to understand and apply the various steps that I outlined here for interpreting any sign-based period. So that's what I wanted to share today. Okay.
Super. Thank you, Mark. One question about the Argala, just for understanding. Is this just to, shall I say, lock the door for the energy, for the potential, just not to go away because of this yoga form in the house?
Well, any sign that gets Shubha Argalas, that is, Argalas that are formed by natural benefics, particularly if those natural benefics are strong, that's a favorable influence on that sign and any results that that sign can give. I won't bring up my chart again, but this Gemini period, I have 3 grahas in the 11th from there and only 2 in the 3rd. So it's an unobstructed Argala, so it really shows a beneficial effect, particularly in terms of 11th house matters, which are gains, right, for the Gemini major period. But as I said, this is a concept that's often very confusing to students. It's a bit complicated. But generally speaking, it's a favorable thing for any sign to have unobstructed Shubha Argalas, that is, Argalas caused by benefics. The general effect is to solidify, and as I said, lock down any favorable effects that the sign can give. So in the example of Kennedy's chart, he's got this very significant Raja Yoga in Aries, right? So the fact that it additionally gets the benefit of these Argalas that I spoke about, that enhances that Raja Yoga, the ability to give its results.
So basically to save the potential.
Correct.
Understood.
But, it's a difficult concept. It confuses people. And you can do Jaimini without using it that much, but it is an element of it that's mentioned in the Jaimini Sutras. So, we have to consider it as being a factor. We shouldn't just ignore it.
Oh, I will definitely use it because I want to use all the methods.
But I would say that it's a kind of a last consideration whenever you're looking at, it's not the first thing I look at. It's probably more, in terms of the steps, it's down there, in terms of one of the last steps. What are the steps again? We see which sign, which house the sign is that's running. That house is, and the indications of that house are going to be a focus during that time, right? Then we might also see what house it is from the Karakamsha Lagna to get some additional information about where the focus will be, right? Then we see the influence of planets either by occupation or aspect onto the sign in 3 different ways. Are they natural benefics or are they natural malefics? What are the natural significations of those planets? And then lastly, what special Jaimini karakas are they? So those are, then we see which planet rules that sign and which karaka is it. Because as I saw, if the the ruler of the sign is the dark arca, then it becomes eligible for giving marriage. And then you want to see padas. Is any sign the pada of any house? Because that gives you some additional information about, say, some events it could bring. And then there's this consideration of Argala that we talked about. So yes, it gets complex, but if you're going to give a thorough assessment of what any sign could bring, you should apply all these steps.
But we don't use the partially things like the Mercury owns 1 and 4 or stuff like that houses in this case.
We'll say that again. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, I mean, should we consider that the planet, for example, for you in this current period, Mercury, in Parashari system, it owns the lord of the whatever, first and 10th.
Well, it's the 10th Lord itself, but actually the way we use it, what karaka is it? And I identified it, it's the AM. Mercury in my chart is the AMK, right? And that's something that we should consider. Anybody who runs the Gemini period, the ruler is going to be Mercury, right? Now, but which house of the horoscope is Gemini? It's the 10th house, right? So in my case, in another person's case, it may be some other house. Okay, well, this is what we wanted to do for today.
Thank you.
Take care. That's going to be a lot to translate. All right. Bye for now. Namaste.